Your Excellency, Dr. Danilo Turk, former President of Slovenia, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, a very good morning to you all. On behalf of Cosmos Foundation, let me welcome you to this very important and timely symposium as part of the Cosmos Dialogue's Distinguished Speaker Series titled The EU and the Contemporary Global Scenario, a Reflection for the Future. I am Nahar Khan, and I would like to personally thank each of you for taking the time to attend this extraordinary gathering. At Cosmos Foundation, it serves as a source of pride and inspiration for us to see how the dialogue series has matured over the last several years and carved out a place for itself in the national discourse of Bangladesh. Many of you may have attended previous installments on a whole range of issues, from the Rohingya crisis to Brexit to the Baul way of life, alongside a consistent focus on Bangladesh's place in the contemporary world through its relations with a number of countries and international organizations such as the UN. Earlier I said many of you because one of our most satisfactory indicators has been that a number of our distinguished guests have taken time out of their busy schedules to attend the dialogue on multiple occasions. This consistency in participants has contributed a great deal to the always engaging and stimulating plenaries that have become a part of the program. Your support along with this journey is extremely important for us. Without further delay, let me thank each of you again for gracing the occasion with your presence. And with that, I'd like to hand it over to the chairman of the Cosmos Foundation, Mr. Inayatullah Khan, to deliver the opening remarks.
Good morning and Assalamu alaikum. May I request to either switch off or put on a silent mode your mobile devices, please. Your Excellency, Dr. Daniela Turk, former President of Slovenia, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. Allow me to welcome all of you back to the first major event of the Cosmos Foundation in 2020. I would naturally like to begin by wishing all present a very happy new year. May it bring for you the best of luck in all your endeavors and all the happiness for you and your families that you cherish. And importantly for us, may you continue to offer your support and guidance to us as friends of the Cosmos Foundation in the years ahead, as you have so steadfastly done in the year past. On our part, we will continue to hold programs and events in the months ahead that you will find both exciting and engaging, as well as mutually rewarding. Throughout the past year, we have remained focused on our goals. We have dedicated ourselves to generating among our friends strategic insights on pressing issues of the day, offering policy options in addressing them. We have held a number of stimulating events with distinguished speakers from across the world on thematic topics as well as on Bangladesh's external relations. The latest was Lord Malik Brown, former Deputy Secretary General of the United Nations, and the current High Commissioner of Canada, Benoit Poffontaine. Our symposia have covered important topics as the social impact of fake news to the Rohingya crisis, to conservation of nature, and so on. And arts and culture, we have helped project Bangladeshi artistic works along with the artists themselves in many important art events, including the Venice Biennale. We have had a number of events on the economy of and potentialities for investments in Bangladesh, in which we have collaborated with many important and renowned think tanks, including ISAS of the National University of Singapore. Next month in February, we are planning for you a symposium that should be of interest to all those interested in the theoretical aspects of foreign policy making. It would be a debate on the values that shape such policies in the East and West. And a key speaker for that will be a former Foreign Secretary of India, Chris Srinivasan, and he's also a member of the Advisory Board of Cosmos Foundation. He has also been a Deputy Secretary General of Commonwealth and the High Commissioner to Bangladesh, and is no stranger to Cosmos, having spoken here before. We are aiming for the 22nd of Feb for that event and look forward to your enthusiastic participation. To return to our event today, it's a huge honor for us to have an European statesman of the global renown, Dr. Daniela Turk, inaugurate our activities for the new year as our first distinguished speaker for 2020. His country, Slovenia, of which he served as president for 5 years, is nestled in the heart of Central and Southeastern Europe, a wealthy state active in the politics of the region. Till 1991, it was a part of Yugoslavia, a country with which Bangladesh had deep connections immediately following our nascence. Today, Slovenia is a member of NATO, the Eurozone, the European Union, and OECD. A high-income advanced economy with a very high level of human development index. Bangladesh and Slovenia enjoy excellent relations, and trade between our two countries is growing, as we also hope investments. Given that with impending Brexit and a modicum of uncertainty within the European Union, our discussions today will actually focus on the subject of Europe, in which our distinguished speaker takes great interest, and one in which he is considered an authority and expert. Dr. Turk has had a distinguished career in diplomacy, politics, and academia. He was Slovenia's first ambassador to the United Nations, the organization that he also served as an Assistant Secretary General. He was also UN Rapporteur on freedom of expression, a right of which he, as an international legal expert, was always a champion. Armed with a PhD in international law, he specialized on minority rights. Successful in domestic politics, he served as Slovenia's president between 2007 and 2012. An author of numerous publications, he is currently a visiting professor at the Columbia University in New York. Our deliberations will be conducted and chaired by Dr. Iftikhar Chaudhry, a scholar diplomat, former foreign affairs advisor who had been for over a decade now the principal research fellow at the prestigious Institute of South Asian Studies, University of Singapore. It is my fond hope that each one of you will find the discussions and deliberations today both engaging and rewarding. With these words, I wish to hand over the microphone to our chair, Dr. Iftikhar Ahmed Chaudhry.
Thank you, and I'll speak from the podium. President Daniela Turk, ambassadors, ladies and gentlemen. I too should like to begin by wishing the friends of Cosmos gathered here a very happy and prosperous New Year. I'm sure all of you have listened with great attention to the excellent program that the Foundation has on offer for you that Chairman Anatullah Khan has laid down in some detail. Our goal is to widen and deepen public understanding of the state of the globe and to support a better informed debate and deliberation, both spoken and written, about our engagement with the region and the world. Everything we do remains anchored in Bangladesh. The idea is being able to help shape Bangladesh's behavior pattern in a way so as to derive maximum benefits from our international interactions. All our programs and joint efforts with the Foundation working together with you, the friends, and thereafter distilling the key takeaway points from the resulting synthesis. That is how we aim to expand knowledge about pressing issues. Nothing gives me greater pleasure than to commence an annual set of activities this year with a keynote address from President Danilo Turk. Inayat has already introduced him to you, though no introductions can do him adequate justice. I should be frightfully remiss if I did not add a personal perspective. Decades ago, Danilo and I lived in the same building in New York. He had a stellar career already in the United Nations by then, and in the field of international law. Thereafter, he went on to achieve great things at home in Slovenia, becoming its president, the president of that country, and then making his mark as an observer and champion of European integration, a subject about which we will hear from him today. The European Union remains a supreme example of nations bearing the hatchet and coming together in a region. Philosophically, as I see it, the idea came from what we call the functionalist thinkers, like David Mitrani and Jean Monnet. It was that if there is collaboration between countries at a functional level, then eventually the core disputes at more critical levels will dissipate. Unsurprisingly, it was a complex operation. A major illustration of this is the complexity that we see now with Britain having to opt out of it, the so-called Brexit, United Kingdom actually. Differences in size, dissimilar levels of economic development, varied historical experiences, a burgeoning bureaucracy in Brussels, diverse views on sovereignty, and elaborate political structures of governance might indeed be creating some tensions. But the commonality of values as of now seems strong enough to act as a glue holding it together. Brexit, of course, will have its impact, not just on Europe, but also countries like ours. Europe will, for all intents and purposes, be a priority in our external interactions. Who knows, we may also thereafter, apart from our relations with the European Union, of course, need to work out a paradigm for relating to the countries of the Anglosphere, of English-speaking nations like the United States, Canada, UK, Australia, New Zealand. Some are already thinking of, and I refer to some Australian literature that I've seen, a market-oriented collaboration, somewhat on the lines of those who are old enough to remember the imperial preference of the past, except that now it will be among countries equal and sovereign, not among the dominions of the old British Empire. Let me hasten to add that while the idea merits reflection, it still awaits deep research. As we enter the year 2020, it would be apt to ponder as to the state of the global system. And some might even challenge if there is such a thing as a system existing today linking us all. Now that, as we see that the global order as we know it is under great pressure, including institutions like the United Nations and the WTO, on which many of us around this table have worked. Already we are witnessing the nascence of mega-regional trading arrangements as the RCEP, which will be established shortly. On the other hand, there is a feeling that single-country massive plans, such as China's Road and Belt Initiative, or Belt and Road Initiative as they call it, which cuts across many regions, erode the idea of regionalism. Regions are often unable to marshal the vast quantum of sums or resources that China's BRI has on offer. There are two main problems with regionalism today. One is that the world is too interconnected, and the borders of regions are disappearing, more so than the borders of countries, which are protected by rules of sovereignty. Regions, however, are not. Regional organizations are often hostage to relationships between principal protagonists, like SARC has been rendered dormant by the acerbic relations between India and Pakistan. Elsewhere, such as in Latin America, Mercosur is threatened by the differences between the two major economies, Brazil and Argentina, as evidenced in their deeply divergent positions on the planned trade act deal with the European Union. The Middle East, for obvious reasons, and as we see in the papers every day and hear in the news, and is not a candidate for regional integration or even collaboration at this time. The European Union's good fortune is that good working relationships exist between the two major protagonists, that's France and Germany. So, many in Bangladesh may wonder, given the state of SAARC, whether continued linkage with South Asia is a good idea, or whether Bangladesh should follow the trade and economic orientation which would recommend stronger links with Europe, North America on one hand, and China on the other. The point that I'm making, it's a scenario with the complexities that we see evolving or developing in the region itself, whether it would be a good idea to, on the one hand, to have good relations with the regional countries, but to emphasize and focus on countries with which we have trade, with which we share intellectual and intellectual ideas, and also who are supportive of our development processes, which would mean, on the one hand, with the European Union, on the other hand, as I said, Anglosphere, and thirdly, with China. These are our markets, and this is from where we obtain our resources for growth and development, infrastructural needs, and even security. There are no easy answers as yet, but thinking about them is an activity for which, to borrow from Victor Hugo's famous dictum, the time may have already come. I thank you. I will now commence the process of conducting the session, and in doing so, it would be my great honor, pleasure, etc., to give the floor to our distinguished speaker of the day, former President Dr. Daniela Turk. Mr. President, you'll have the floor for about 40 minutes or so, and then we'll open the floor to Q&A.
Thank you. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak today. I'd like to express my special gratitude to Cosmos Club and Mr. Anayatullah Khan for having invited me to this event. I feel deeply honored for having the opportunity to speak today and to address an important subject which is already a matter of large discussion, and a discussion which will inevitably continue. It's an important subject of European Union and the world, and of course about the world itself, as we have heard from Iftikhar Ahmad Chowdhury, who just spoke and who gave us a very succinct, very good basis for thought and for discussion today. I should also like to say that I'm very grateful for being here in Dhaka at this particular moment, which is the birth centenary of Bangabandhu, Sheikh Mujibur Rahman. And I would like to tell you, before I start talking about European Union or global issues, that for somebody of my generation, this is really something of deep symbolic significance. I do remember the developments in 1971 and 72 very well, very carefully. And Sheikh Mujibur Rahman was, in fact, a household name in Slovenia and in former Yugoslavia and throughout Europe, not least because of the Beatles and the whole youth movement, which was very sympathetic to the plight of people in Bengal and to the self-determination effort of the people of Bengal, which Sheikh Mujibur Rahman was able to articulate in a way which resonated throughout the world. It's a really a very important experience for me as, at that time, young student who have started to think about such fundamental questions as self-determination in the post-colonial period, as the question of development of an identity of a nation, the question of intervention of big powers, the question of use of force, the question of humanitarian problems and humanitarian assistance. Now, these are all big questions which we became aware of in the context of independence of Bangladesh. And that should never be underestimated, because many years later, as an academic and also as a UN diplomat, I was coming back to that same old experience of which I started to learn something back in 71 and 72. And I remember even moments in the Security Council discussions later in 1998, when I referred to this whole experience in light of new experience which were accumulating towards the end of the century. So I think today is really a very symbolic day. I mean, the beginning of the whole centenary process, which I understand will last for months now, should give us thought about the world as it was at that time and as it is today. And we can go even further, because the independence of Bangladesh coincided with big shifts at the global level. That was also the time when the power of the United States was weakening, and the United States at that time had a very visionary president, Richard Nixon, who guided his then National Security Advisor, Henry Kissinger, to travel to China and open the way to communication between the United States and China, and developing a new pattern of global dialogue at the highest level. That is when the whole triangular relationship started to be discussed. And that triangular relationship led to further discussion whether the world is going to move into a pentagonal relationship with, of course, the three main players, United States, Soviet Union, China, and West Europe and Japan will be the main pattern around which most of the international developments will move. Now, that was then, in early 1970s. Things have turned out differently, as we know, but it is useful to come back to these old questions and to reflect about the world of today in light of the experience. And that experience very much has to do with this, with what was experienced in 1970s. We should also think about the subsequent experience, which was diverse in different parts of the world. I'm not going to talk today about Western Balkans or about Yugoslavia or about developments in Europe historically, but I would be remiss if I didn't say that one of the big things that happened since then was success of Bangladesh, something that is often in expert circles described as a quiet success, as something that has moved Bangladesh to a point where the poverty level will be reduced to a point that will change the status of the country. Bangladesh has established itself as the key player in the world textiles and garment industry, has established itself as an important player in the questions of social progress. Of course, the whole world knows about Grameen Bank, and that has led to much thinking in every part of the world. In very many ways, the question of credit and microcredit was influenced by that. And of course, for tomorrow, we also have to think about climate change, the way Bangladesh has experienced climate change and is making itself a factor in the global discussions about climate change. Now, I would like us to think about all this as we meet today and as we discuss the question of European Union in the global scenario. But of course, being fully aware that that global scenario includes a very wide variety of experience, and the experience of Bangladesh is a very important experience in this overall context. Now let me proceed from here and say a few words about global scenario, bearing in mind something that Iftikhar, my friend, has already explained. These are things which will require profound studies and a lot of thinking and a lot of political wisdom in the future. This is not something that we can kind of outline in a very simple and quick fashion. but I will try to refer to some points which I believe are important in this overall discussion about global scenario for today and for the future. The structure of the global relations is changing, and that's nothing new. But it is changing in a way which is very significant. It is changing towards a new type of multipolarity. Again, moving from a short period of seemingly unipolar world to a multipolar world is something which is widely recognized today. What is less clearly done is a definition and description of what this new multipolarity really means. How does it work, and what it contains. Now, I would like to submit for your reflection the following few points. First, obviously, there are three key players in this emerging multipolarity. In addition to United States, China as the other significant factor, Russia as a factor coming back and taking full advantage of its geopolitical location, its diplomacy, its military modernization, and so on, and diplomatic clout. But there are other things here. One is the fact that the multipolarity today reaches more deeply than a classical power-based analysis would suggest. Multipolarity today means different versions of modernity. It means different conceptions of statehood and legitimacy. State's legitimacy cannot be defined in a single set of concepts. It may mean different things in different parts of the world. What looked some 20 years ago as a clear end of history style of movement towards liberal democracy model has been stopped, and new types of relations within societies are emerging. Many of them, some of them, actually leading to a degree and a type of legitimacy which may be perfectly sufficient for the next historic period, but different from liberal democracy. And this is something that has to be kept in mind and discussed in our discussions about the global scenario. Then obviously the other thing that has to be discussed in this same context is the nature and the dynamic of US-China relationship, which is a kind of a central political relationship in this broader picture. Here, I would submit that one of the questions that have to be given particular attention is how does one manage cooperation and competition? Now, obviously, every situation in a pluralistic system includes both. There is always a degree of cooperation involved and always some competition. But now we see the competition aspect rising and cooperation aspect being challenged. I would submit that competition basically is a good thing. Competition makes people work harder, think harder, and figure out solutions better. So competition in essence is that. But competition has to be managed, as we know from economy. Competition has to be according to certain rules. Otherwise, it may end up in disasters. And when it comes to the great powers, the question of kind of sliding into disasters is always there. It is therefore not surprising that very serious political analysts started to write about the so-called Thucydides trap in that context. And I'm sure that you are all familiar with the work of American political scientist Graham Allison, who wrote very well about Thucydides trap, the possibility that the fear of, by the established power, of changes giving more strength to the rising power may actually lead in wars, which is what happened in history too often. My submission here is that when one talks about competition and Thucydides trap, one should read Thucydides, not only Graham Allison. Graham Allison has a very valid analysis, and he is on the right track. He says we have to do everything in our power to prevent sliding into war. But one element of prevention of war is already described very well in Thucydides himself. He wrote in the book 1 of Peloponnesian Wars about the discussions that were taken place in Sparta, at that time the established power which was afraid of Athens, the rapidly rising power. And I often think if we only had the level of sophistication in our discussion that we see in Thucydides in his book, we would be in a much better situation. The sophistication, the seriousness of argument there is something that really has to give us a lot to think about. In that discussion, we find the words of the king of Sparta, Archidemos, who spoke about the fact that no war is inevitable, that every war brings much worse results than were originally imagined, and that no war is inevitable. There is no such a thing as inevitable wars, and that things have to be tried that would make war not happen. Now, he speaks about arbitration. He speaks about institutions that existed in those days and which were very much under the religious, how should I say, umbrella of the culture of the ancient Greece. But now we have a whole set of international institutions which could be very helpful and which must not be marginalized, which must be made use of. So let us think about Thucydides' trap as the kind of the ultimate challenge and the variety of ways of prevention of war as a real possibility. I'm not suggesting that the war is imminent. Let me be very clear on that too. But obviously, competition, unless wisely managed, can lead to unexpected situations. Today, we are facing the situation of trade war between the United States and China, and that too can go out of hand. We are entering a period of technology war between the United States and China, something that will have a huge impact not only on the two principal players, but also on European Union and on every country in the world. So therefore, I think all this leads us to conclude that we have to think about managing competition in the right way and moving it towards cooperative arrangements where cooperation and competition are in a consonance. I would like to mention here that obviously whatever we see in the World Trade Organization today should also not discourage us too much. Of course, we know that now the appellate body is not functioning because of the American insistence of not appointing additional judges. But we have to understand one thing, and that is that World Trade Organization has undergone huge changes in the period after World War II. It was proposed in 1948 and outright rejected as being inimical to free trade. And then it was reintroduced as a general agreement on tariffs and trade in a much more modest way and dealt with a variety of problems of trade over decades to become, again, a necessity and re-established back in 1994 with the whole system which is now under stress. Of course, changes can be profound. Changes can be dramatic. But the need for multilateral trade system is there, and the solutions of management of competition require re-establishment or proper definition of multilateral trading system in the new circumstances. Of course, we can come back to these questions later in the discussions if this is of interest. Now, talking about European Union, let me come to European Union after having spoken a little bit about the global scenario. Iftikhar already mentioned that European Union has been defined in a functional sense. That's the word you used, and I think that that's a very important word. European Union has been defined as a functional system. Now, I'm saying this because as a European, I'm aware of the fact that in European history, there was never a shortage of great visions. Visions of Europe as a place which could be more unified, more systematized, and so forth. Some of those visions were actually quite harmful. Adolf Hitler had such a harmful vision. And then it was after two world wars, which happened mainly on the European continent, or largely on the European continent, that European leaders came to a definition that actually works, and that is a functional definition, a pragmatic definition. Let us start with what works, and let us develop that further, keeping in mind the basic values that bind us, but offering us patterns of cooperation and common institutions that would lead us forward. So practical, pragmatic, functional. This is the way European Union was designed, and this is the way in which European Union can progress. And European Union should, of course, in this context, be aware of the fact that its role in the world cannot remain the same. The European Union accounted for 25% of global population back in 1900. Now it is like 5%. So inevitably things have to change. The world is developing, and the GDP of European Union, which was once more recently, at the beginning of this century, more than a quarter of the whole world GDP, is now less than 20%. That is not because of any sort of stagnation of European space, but because others are growing, and in that changing circumstances, European Union has to figure out its own ways. And in order to figure out its own ways, the European Union has to be aware of one fundamental, I would say, quasi-physical factor. You know, European Union is like a human person standing on two legs. One leg is member states of European Union, which have to be healthy and helpful, and the other leg is European institutions. Both of them have to work well, both of them have to work in consonance in order to ensure progress. If one side starts to weaken, then this has an effect on the other side as well. European Union consists of sovereign states, and sovereignty is not going to go away. It's not going to disappear. Sovereignty is going to stay as a defining factor for member states, and political evolution within member states will be within sovereignty of states. There is no such a thing as pan-European demos to kind of, which could make sovereign states irrelevant or not very important. European states are going to remain relevant and important, and that becomes evident when things like populism start to grow. Then it appears that this is a threat to European Union. But in fact, what is happening is populism is an internal political development which has to be understood and which has to be addressed through policies of nation states, but also through policies of European Union. It is not something that one could describe as a definitive and defining pan-European phenomenon. It's a phenomenon within states, it's diverse, it has a certain common basis, which I would call a nationalistic platform, but it has many various forms, different forms, and the power of populism is not the same in every country and is not the same over a period of time. So it shouldn't be overestimated. It should be understood as part of political process within countries. And of course, this is not the only political process. There are other political processes which also have to be given attention. This week, European countries have, the world has seen, excuse me, two new governments having been formed in Spain and in Austria. And it is really very interesting to see how the composition of those two governments look. In Austria, for example, now we see a coalition between the conservatives, the Volkspartei, the conservative party, and the Greens. And Greens have been growing everywhere in Europe in the past years. Now Greens became a government party in a coalition with the Conservative Party, which is a completely new thing. Greens are more to the left in traditional ideological terms, but traditional ideological terms are no longer what they once were. So they can perhaps work well with the conservatives as well. And we have to see how that works. Austria has a young prime minister, Sebastian Kurz, who is in his 30s. I guess in Asia he would be seen as far too young to be prime minister, I mean, culturally speaking. But in Europe, he's also seen as very young, but acceptable as candidate and as prime minister, and one who can perhaps deliver some innovations which we need for how to work together and how much of the green ideology will be accepted by the Conservative Party. So it's a very interesting phenomenon which started with the coalition which started working this week. In Spain, Pedro Sanchez, the socialist, put together a minority government, and that minority government vitally depends on the outside support of several parties, including Catalan parties. And the main Catalan party, ERC, is supporting the government from outside at a time when tensions between Madrid and Barcelona are still very high. So you see a very interesting development here, a development where each of the sides, if one reduces the kind of focus now to Madrid-Barcelona relationship, the Catalans being quite important for the budget of Spain as a whole, and the government of Spain being aware of that, interested in negotiating future arrangements with Catalans in ways which would be helpful to both sides. So we see a complicated and risky development, but one which is new, one which tells us a little bit about the complexity and about the interesting character of European states. Now, let me come to European institutions. I use these two examples to show and to emphasize that European Union has to be understood fully, and that has to include the political nature of things within states. I'll come to Brexit a little later, but I'm not going to elaborate on that. I mean, you have had Mark Malloch-Brown, and he knows everything about Brexit, so I don't want to be to try to be smart. But I will have something to say a little later in a different context. I just use the examples of Spain and Austria as ones which are interesting. There are quite a few minority governments in Europe nowadays, including in my country, Slovenia, which has a minority government, a coalition government of 5 parties. But somehow it manages things. The budget has been approved. Now the question of reforms is there, and we'll see what happens. Now, so the political developments within European countries are likely to be interesting. The second thing is the European institutions. Now, again, European institutions have to be careful. They depend on member states, surely, but they have to be also responsible to show the way forward. To show the way forward. And how does one do that in the current circumstances is an interesting question. It has happened before. European Union institutions were able to show the way forward. In the past, we should always think about the great leap forward led by Jacques Delors and his commission in 1980s. And I can say that because I was teaching international law in Ljubljana at that time, and Yugoslavia were not member of the European community at that time, obviously, in 1980s. But the pull effect of leadership of Jacques Delors was such that all of a sudden, after the adoption of what was called the Single European Act, I got, I say, dozens of students who wanted to write diploma works about European integration. The interesting thing was that European institutions can, if they do the right things, provide leadership to the people. Now, how is this going to happen? What can happen in the present time? Here I would like to draw your attention to something that has already been decided in the European Union and has the potential of becoming important for the coming 2 years, and that is the Conference on the Future of Europe. The Conference on Future of Europe is a mechanism which is being established that would include the European Commission, European Parliament, and they would look into the question of what kind of new solutions, new agreements or amendments to existing ones will move the European democracy further. The question is, how does one look into the European Union comprehensively, and how does one involve citizens in the process of shaping European institutions for the future? That's basically the idea of the Conference on the Future of Europe. The conference is going to be launched in February this year, and it is going to go on for 2 years. So we'll see what happens in that context. Now, in my opinion, there is a basic question which we need to think about in the context of the Conference on the Future of Europe. And that question is this. The political democracy and legal changes are something that may have to happen. But the critical question is what kind of policies should be in the center of European Union for the future. what are the policy priorities and what are the policy instruments that make future changes possible and helpful. There is always, everybody who has studied law will agree that there is always a very subtle and very important relationship between law and policy. Law is there to define various types of relations, but it is usually effective if it serves a good idea, a good policy. And here, when we talk about the Conference on the Future of Europe, we do not see that policy orientation clearly defined as yet. So while the conference will look into participation, into involving European institutions, European citizens in new ways, the question of policy will remain central and one which I would like you to pay attention to. Let me illustrate what I'm saying with a quote from President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, who described the conference in the following ways. And I quote, "I want citizens to have their say at the Conference on the Future of Europe, to start in 2020 and to run for 2 years. The conference should bring together citizens, including a significant role of young people, civil society, and European institutions as equal partners. Equal partners. The conference should be well prepared with a clear scope and clear objectives agreed between Parliament, the Council, and the Commission. I'm ready to follow up on what is agreed, including by legislative action if appropriate. I'm also open to treaty change." So here is an offer. You people figure out what you want to do, and I will help by developing an appropriate legal framework. So at present, the idea of the conference is political, and it is also defined in a procedural way, but in the sense of what kind of policy it should serve, it is not yet defined. And that will depend on the discussions on European Union, but also I would submit from the inputs from the outside world, because the world will be watching, the world will be commenting, and European Union will not be able to ignore that. Now, there are obviously questions that already emerge and have to be put into the picture and will influence the policies in the future. And I would like to refer, as by way of example, to two such things. One is the European Green Deal, which is becoming a centerpiece of policy making for Europe in the coming period, something that will have an impact on the Conference on the Future of Europe, something that will have an impact on the future of European Union. And then there is another one which is deeper, even much more deeper, and that is the question of solidarity within the European Union. Let me very briefly refer to both of them. First, on the European Green Deal, that has been already outlined in the various activities at the end of last year and the beginning of that year. And you, I'm sure, have already read about this in the media. But let us simply recall that the European Green Deal will consist at least of 4 critical important elements. First, new European climate law, which will have the target of making a European Union carbon-free by 2050, and which will be including very centrally the pricing of carbon emissions for every person and every sector. So European climate law is one element. Secondly, a new European Climate Pact, which will include an arrangement between regional and local authorities, civil society groups, and other actors, with an aim to provide the widest platform for people to engage in the whole European Green Deal process. Very important one. As former president, I must tell you, when I was traveling to schools in Slovenia, I usually asked, what are you doing about environment? And say, oh yes, we have an environmental group in our school, and children are enthusiastic. They would like to change things. Children from all ages, let's say from from 10 to 18, they were really very enthusiastic about the thing. So I mean, mobilizing people, mobilizing young generation for that would be extremely important. Don't think that Greta Thunberg is a coincidence. It relates to a very profound thought among young people in Europe and probably in other parts of the world as well, and that should be somehow encapsulated in the European Climate Pact. The third one would be new industrial policy, which would try to move the idea of circular economy further. So industries should reduce the amount of waste, or should work in ways which would recirculate waste and therefore reduce the pressure on environment. Now that, of course, is an interesting thing, because the European Union has been discussing the circular economy ideas for a long time now. It hasn't gone very far, but the concept is there, and it relates to many things that the partners of European Union have to think about, including in the area of textiles and clothing, because it is understood that textiles is one of the areas where recycling is most necessary. Now, what exactly does that mean? How exactly this changes things in Europe, and how does it affect partners of Europe, in particular a country like Bangladesh, which is very dependent on textiles, is an important question. But it will be very central among the key elements of European Green Deal. And finally, mobilization of funds, both public and private, where European Union is expecting to have a mobilization of about 1 trillion euros over the next decade, between 2020 and 2030. Now, 1 trillion is a fairly large amount of money and has to be thought about as well. So this is the ambition level that is shown in the European Green Deal, and one would say, well, you know, we'll see what happens, and if things go the way they are designed, this will have a transformative effect on the European Union, both internally and in its role as a partner to others in the world. Let me say a few words about solidarity, which is really deep down the key of existence of European Union, because European Union is based, as Iptekar told us, on a functional approach, but also on certain values, and those values have to be proven in daily life. Here I would like to invite you to think critically and discuss critically everything that you hear about values, because values are very often brought into political discourse in an extremely superficial way. You know, so values are something that we use when we want to say we are good. We are good because we have values, or we have different values, or we have superior values. And the implication being that others are not so good because they either don't have values or their values are somehow inferior. Now, of course, I know that this is a dangerous path to take, but what I would like to invite you to do is really be critical when you hear to talk of values. Now, when it comes to values in the European context, values have to be proven in daily practice, not only in speeches of politicians. And in order for that to happen, European Union has to define solidarity within the Union in ways which are adequate to our time. European Union was a big success and continues to be a big success because it is a union of states which all believed in the idea of welfare state. State has to help everybody. So the idea of welfare state led to the whole thing of European social model, and that is the real value. That's something that people feel in their daily lives, and that is what they like. And the departure from there to something else is usually accompanied by difficulties. Also, if you impose a carbon tax in a way which reduces that sense that European Union is doing something good for you, as we see now with the LOS problem in France, that's a question of values. Is there enough solidarity in society, within the country and in Europe, to really take care of the needs of the people? So solidarity is really critical, and it has to be thought in ways which are new. Now, that means, in my opinion, that solidarity has to embrace also questions of differences in development which are regional, which are not very visible on surface, but which are very real. There are regions in Europe which are much less developed than other regions. And in every country this happens. In my country, Slovenia, we have endless discussion about how to organize ourselves as regions to make better use of European funds, the so-called cohesion funds, that the effect would be greater and that people will live better. All this has to do with the changing idea of the welfare state and the changing idea of solidarity. So in the future, I would like to invite you to think about the question of cohesion funds and territorialized development within European Union as something important. This from the outside doesn't look really immediate. It's not something that outside partners would want to discuss in any details, but it is really quite fundamental, and the European Green Deal will have to be designed in a way which will take care of all these questions of solidarity. Therefore, it will be a need to revisit convergence objectives in the European Union, the need to look into the question of income equality and taxation in a very careful way, the question of the monetary system will have to be looked at carefully, and also with the outside world, we have to see to what extent will the idea of competitiveness with the rest of the world impact the whole internal discussion, which will be motivated by that need to uphold solidarity and define the question of solidarity in ways which are adequate to our time. Now, all this is going to happen at a time when there are going to be additional challenges before the European Union. If the basic agenda will include such ambitious ideas as European Green Deal and the need to redefine solidarity in ways which would move European Union further, this is not going to happen in vacuum. European Union is not an academic project, and therefore it has to deal with political problems as they arise. And of course, here one cannot avoid saying a few words about Brexit. And I promise you that I shall be very short. Now, we have a situation when the whole Brexit debate is moving to a new stage, but that stage is not going to be simple. The slogan, "Get Brexit done," is good enough as a political slogan. It can be very effective for electoral purposes. But then when it comes to negotiations, it tends to become insufficient, and there have to be more complicated issues to be dealt with. A trade deal which will be negotiated between United Kingdom and European Union this year is likely to be a complicated discussion, because what needs to be avoided is hard borders, quotas, and other harsh instruments that can make trade and economic cooperation difficult. We in the European Union would like to keep the supply chains as they are, without interruptions. We do not wish to reduce the opportunities for service providers from United Kingdom in European Union to be severely diminished, or vice versa. So negotiations will have to find a fine balance between the need for separation, which is of course the essence of Brexit, and then not cutting supply chains, not reducing the opportunities for service providers too much. And that is likely to be difficult. European Union, as you know, is for tariff-free and quota-free bilateral trade agreement. It wants that negotiations take into account the questions of labor, taxation, state aid, environment, and things like this, which are difficult to negotiate. Now, how this is going to be done is unclear, and whether it can be done in a single year is not sure. But what I would like to submit for our thinking and for the thinking in Cosmos Club, look at this Brexit discussion from the point of view of practical arrangements which are necessary, where the basic requirement is borders that would reduce the capacity of existing supply chains or existing service providers. Let us see how balance can be struck to keep what we have to the largest extent possible. And then, of course, at the political level, obviously, Great Britain has, United Kingdom has its own great history and wants to be global, which is something that I personally appreciate and admire, and I hope to succeed, that this will succeed. We are moving back to the era of Winston Churchill, who has always considered Europe to be in a need for a kind of a single system, but not including Britain. When he spoke about the Council of Europe in 1948, he carefully explained that Britain would not be part of it, but that continental Europe needs something else. Now we are at this point now, but that point is not political only. That point is very seriously dependent on economy, on supply chains, on movement of goods, on movement and provision of services, and on everything that goes with that, legislation that goes with that. And that requires taxes, labor, environmental protection, state subsidies. All these things are on the table. And all these things will have to be negotiated. So this is one of the political challenges. The other one, which I would like to mention as an example, is the challenge of expansion of European Union. If European Union is going to proceed in the direction of European Green Deal and redefinition of solidarity, it has to deal with practical questions like reduction of European Union because of Brexit, but it also has to deal with expansion of European Union because there are countries that are knocking on the doors of European Union. Southeastern Europe is such a place, and there things are not going very well. You may have heard that the Prime Minister of Northern Macedonia resigned last week, Zoran Zaev. This is a man who negotiated the deal with Greece on the name. The name Northern Macedonia has been accepted by Macedonians in the expectation that that will help starting the process of eventual membership of Macedonia in the European Union. That did not happen. The European Union has not accepted that. And that, I think, was a big mistake, which can still be corrected. We'll see how that works, but it's not going to be easy. This semester, the President of European Union is Croatia, another country of successor state of former Yugoslavia, and obviously for Croatia this is a very big priority, so the European Summit in May will deal with the question of Southeastern Europe and the membership question. We'll see what happens there. But I would like you to think not only about the core issues of European Union, not only about Brexit as an immediate political and negotiating problem, but also about expansion. Can reform and expansion take place at the same time? Well, that's a good question, but not one which is easy to answer. Now, these are the things which have to do with European Union. This is not a whole list, and it doesn't address everything. I would like very quickly, in a telegraphic sense, mention a few others, and then I will conclude. On security role of European Union, obviously there is going to be a big debate in the coming years. I myself belong to those, and I'm prepared to discuss this in our discussion, who believe that a greater autonomy of European Union in security matters is possible. That is a tendency which exists in European Union. It's not the only one. It can be autonomy, strategic autonomy of European Union within NATO. How that can be worked out is a matter of separate discussion, and if that is interesting, I can say a few words more about it in terms of my own thinking. When it comes to Russia, I think the need for for managing those relations for European Union is going to increase. That need is going to be ever stronger in the situation as I described and given the developments internationally. Sanctions obviously will remain for the time being, but there are other aspects which will have to be dealt with, such as the question of gas pipelines and the American nervousness about them. That too we can discuss later if that's of interest. On EU-China, obviously we have another fundamental question. how to manage cooperation and competition, which I described, I sketched out, not really described, in terms of US-China relationship. A similar question has arisen as regards the European Union as well, with of course one important difference, and that is that there is no trade war between European Union and China. There are effects of trade war between United States and China, but no trade war between European Union and China, and it should stay like this. European Union will have to deal with some of the more difficult questions on technology, especially when it comes to G5. But we'll see what happens there. It's not clear as yet. And then European Union and China have two very important common interests. One is to preserve World Trade Organization. And in the World Trade Organization, China and European Union have already come with several common initiatives, which is a good thing and should continue. And of course, as things are becoming more complicated, it will continue in more complicated environment. And then on the big thing, the question of environment, EU and China should explore the possibility of engaging very seriously on the question of climate change and what to do to make sure that the world doesn't end up in a disaster. I mentioned the centrality of European Green Deal for European Union, and that means also an invitation to China for a serious discussion. So in conclusion, I would like to say that European Union is in a very delicate and very complex situation, both domestically and internationally. And the European Union is clearly going to stay a major factor of development assistance, a major supporter of multilateralism and so forth. And so when it comes to these fundamentals, this is not going to change. But at the same time, European Union will have to find the right approach to deal with European internal problems, such as European Green Deal, solidarity, managing Brexit, institutional reforms, Balkans, issues that I described, and also externally, making progress with regard to NATO, relationship within NATO, engaging Russia, cooperation with China, and so forth. You have noticed that I haven't spoken about Iran, because Iran brings into this picture another set of complicated questions which would require a separate discussion. I didn't want to enter into that discussion during my introduction, but of course I'm perfectly happy to discuss that if there are things that you need to discuss. As you probably know, the European Union foreign ministers have met yesterday and have pleaded for continued existence of JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal, and we can discuss various aspects here as far as you need, as far as you think that this is a subject for our discussion. I would like to end up by saying thank you for your attention. Thank you for having chosen this theme for your discussion. I would like to congratulate Cosmos Club once again for the program which I heard, which is going to make this year very interesting. And let me assure you, I like to come to Bangladesh. As I say, my formation is very strongly linked to the historic experience of Bangladesh. My friendships with Bangladeshi diplomats is strong and has been going on for many years by now. So if you think that I could be helpful sometime in the future, I will be happy to come again. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Danilo. It was excellent, of course. Not that we expected anything less from you. It was, you know, it fits in very nicely with what we set for ourselves as the mandate and Cosmos, that nothing can, in international relations, can be discussed in isolation. So we talked about, and as you did, Danilo, about the global matrix on which things happening everywhere can be placed. Interestingly, you began with a mention of the Thucydides trap. Initially, this was very European, very Greek, city-state focused, and where explaining the Peloponnesian War, Thucydides had said that when Athens grew strong, the great fear in Sparta. But it didn't remain confined to Europe, because as you'll notice that almost in every Chinese major policy statement today, they make a reference to Thucydides' trap. And the Chinese idea of great power relationships between America and China is based on that, so that the growth of power on one side is not misinterpreted and does not accidentally lead to conflict, which of course Graham Ellis says that it does not need to happen. I mean, there need not be war inevitable. But it just shows how globalized thinking has become. That is the point I'm making. Something that came in classical Greece is now thought of in Asia. You have touched on, of course, relations between Europe and other parts of the world. You haven't quite touched South Asia, but you would, I assume that since you have invited discussions on questions on Iran, and there would be questions on how European Union perceives South Asia, because the initial South Asian integration, as we saw it, was also based on the same kind of functionalism that European Union was, which was the philosophical paradigm of the European Union. So it was an excellent discussion, I think. You talked of values and you invited us to critique values, and that is exactly what Cosmos is going to do on the 22nd of February, because we look to a seamless transition into another thematic debate with Chris Srinivasan of India talking about values in foreign policy making. So we will have that debate, and that will be a seamless transition to that level. Anyway, the floor will now be open, and I will begin by recognizing two colleagues, Ambassador Farooq Subhan, Ambassador Shamim Ahmed, General Munir Zaman, the first three. Yeah, one needs a mic. We'll put them in clusters of three. Okay, hello.
Yeah, there are microphones available. I'd like to begin by thanking the Cosmos Foundation for organizing what is really an extremely interesting event, and in particular to thank you, Dr. Daniela Turk, for this very stimulating and enlightening talk to which we have just listened to. I have 2 points, and I'd like you to kindly comment on them. The first relates to the issue of European or EU values. If we look at the EU membership today, my sort of rough rule of thumb is that perhaps 50%, maybe more, of the membership is today following policies which I would consider to be in serious contradiction of fundamental EU values. I refer in particular to the rise of populism. Some might even describe this as xenophobia in some of the EU countries, where basic rights such as freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, and freedom of the press are being increasingly questioned. How does this relate to the future of Europe and the future of the European Union? And this also brings into focus the issue of the further expansion of the European Union. We know that for a certain period of time there was keen interest on the part of Turkey to join the European Union. Is that now a closed chapter? My second point relates to the former Yugoslavia. I happened, in fact, to serve in Belgrade from 74 to 76. And I remember one of the issues which struck us was the significant disparities in terms of both economic growth and quality of life and levels of income, for example, between Slovenia and Macedonia and Kosovo, which are now independent states. My question is, was the disintegration of Yugoslavia inevitable, in your view? And how does that gel with the fact that all the constituent members of what was the former Yugoslavia are now aspiring to be members of the European Union? Some have succeeded, others are in the queue. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Shamim Ahmed. Shamim, might I say that, okay, I mean, the chair, of course, would recognize everyone, and however, should you have an affiliation, you are welcome to state your affiliation as well, which will facilitate interactions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Firstly, my thanks to the Cosmos Foundation for this lecture, and also thank you so much, Ambassador Daniela Turk, for your excellent presentation. We are greatly enlightened. My question will basically relate to the United Nations. You haven't really spoken much on the UN system. In view of your long-standing relationship with the UN system, where you served as your country's ambassador and later at a very senior position at the UN Secretariat, what is Europe's position? How does Europe look at the United Nations as an effective vehicle for cooperation and particularly for conflict resolution? And what is Europe's position on, particularly Slovenia's, on the question of UN reforms, with particular reference to the Security Council reform? Thank you.
We might take two by two now because we don't have a very long list as yet. So yes, let him respond to the two, and then I'll recognize General Munir-Zaman, Mr. Salahuddin Qasim Khan, and Admiral Awal. If I have left out anyone, you might wish to raise your flag or hand. Okay, that's right.
All right. Very briefly on each of the questions, of course, which are deep and will have to be discussed on many occasions. First, on values and European Union. Clearly, as I said in my introduction, values is something that European Union has to examine and re-examine critically. We should not stick to the tradition of using values as a rhetorical tool, describing ourselves and feeling good. You know, there are two things in life: either you feel good or you do good. And usually you don't do much good by just feeling good. And European Union is in a situation in which it has to do more to do good. So I agree with the underlying assumption that Europe has a lot of critical self-examination to do. Now, in that, it can expect some assistance from the Council of Europe and the European Court of Human Rights, which can take care of some of these problems, but not all of them. Not all of these problems. Some of the problems here are clearly political. And when it comes to the question of xenophobia, for example, much more needs to be done in that regard. I myself, for example, when I was president, I helped establishing the first Islamic center in Slovenia. Because we have many people who came from Bosnia and from other places who were Muslims, and they didn't have their own religious place. We have obtained some funds, including from abroad, and now the Islamic Center will be open in June this year. I was invited to Oxford to the Center for Islamic Studies to speak about the whole experience and other thoughts that I may have. And I'm in the process of thinking what we can do. Now in Slovenia we do not have a very high level of xenophobia. There is practically no trace of Islamophobia. But that's the surface. You know, things can change and become nasty very quickly. So we have to be really very vigilant and do things the right way. Now, I'm using this example simply to illustrate that there is a whole range of very different issues or different policy approaches one has to take into account. One is Council of Europe and the European Court of Human Rights. But that is going to deal only with things which are expressed in legal sense. There are many things which are not, and they have to be expressed otherwise. One example I gave, and there are many more which can be quoted. On Turkey, I think there we are witnessing a very profound process of change, which is not only in European Union, but primarily in Turkey itself. Turkey is not relying on European Union membership at present. It is developing a new role for itself, and that would require a separate discussion. What is exactly the trajectory on which Turkey has put itself, the trajectory in which Turkey has put itself, and what can be expected as a result? Turkey is playing a big role in the region and now in Libya, so it's hard to say, but clearly membership in European Union is neither the priority for Turkey or for European Union. As far as former Yugoslavia is concerned, very briefly, I would say that disintegration was not inevitable. It could be prevented if the whole question of national identities was managed better. But the main mistake started to accumulate in 1970s, and in 1980s they just went into a very negative direction, in a direction which was exacerbated by the economic crisis and everything. It's a complex story, but my brief answer would be it was not inevitable. It happened as a result of an accumulation of mistakes started in the 70s and becoming irreversible in mid-80s. Now, on the UN system, I would say, of course, the reform of the Security Council is not on the cards right now. But one point that I would like to make about the United Nations is this. This is a bad time for the United Nations. I don't remember the time when United Nations was so under so strong pressure as today, and I have been with United Nations since mid-70s and worked in various ways in various parts of the UN system. I don't think that it has ever been under such strong pressure it is today. One element I would like to invite you to think about is the question of risk-taking in the United Nations. Because when it comes to climate and such things, here United Nations is clearly defined. It's clearly taken advantage of Sustainable Development Goals, which emerged as a kind of a miracle in 2015. But when it comes to peace and security, it has been characterized by really very cautious, perhaps even overcautious approach by the Secretaries General. So my provocative answer to your very careful question would be, UN needs more courage for risk-taking and dealing with issues which are central, even if success is not guaranteed. And that's, I think, a critical thing. Very often, I was Assistant Secretary General for Political Affairs, and I know many discussions at the time of Kofi Annan, is the Secretary General going to engage when we know that he's not likely to succeed? His good offices are always available, and that's the easy answer, to say, well, you know, Secretary General can always be there for good offices, but he may not always be asked. So the question is UN prepared for risk-taking, or is the time now to move to a different level of risk-taking? I don't have the answer, but you may have a need to discuss this further.
Very good. Next on my list is General Munir Zaman. You may wish to give out your affiliation, name your affiliation.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. President, I'm General Munir Zaman. I'm President of Bangladesh Institute of Peace and Security Studies, which is an independent security think tank in Dhaka. I have two very quick, short questions. The first one is, EU has a problem of aging population. It also has a problem of declining birth rate. At the same time, EU was grossly challenged very recently by the migration that came into your area and your region. At the same time, EU is still bordered by countries which are unstable extra-regionally. Like, for example, Libya is going through a big upheaval now. So what are your plans to manage and stabilize migration policy into EU in the future? The second question is, we see a disturbing trend of decline of liberal democracy in some of the member states. What are your policies? How would you value the value system that you hold so dear? Thank you.
Thank you very much. We'll take two more. Mr. Salahuddin Qasim Khan, and then Admiral Awal.
Thank you for giving me the floor, Chairman. I think this was an excellent presentation by...
Would you like to speak a little louder?
We had today one of the best Cosmos has arranged. My question is whether the European values you talked about are civilizational values, and is that the reason why Turkey is still not a member of the EU, being a member of NATO? Secondly, the double standards in international relations. We talk about the Iranian nuclear capability, which is specifically for peaceful purposes, whereas we don't talk about Israel's nuclear capability. I think the European Union has to take a stand because, you know, we see what's happening in Israel every day, and our youth are being radicalized because of that, the injustice in Palestine and the illegal intervention of Muslim states, which has led to the huge refugee problem, intervention in Iraq, in Libya, and now in Syria. When Gaddafi was there, when Saddam was there, the refugees, I mean, they had functional states. Libya had one of the best social, states. I mean, they had pensions, they had, what's happened to Libya? It's been divided into two states. And some of the countries are supporting one against the other. So, you know, we look up to EU to take a more balanced view of the world. Otherwise, Excellency, the Professor Huntington's paper, which he stated 3 decades ago, we'll have a clash of civilizations. The European Christian civilization, the Islamic civilization, the Cynic, and other civilizational forces are going to take over. So we look up to Europe to be that balance in world affairs. Thank you, sir.
So, the symposium, as you see, is deepening. Admiral Awal.
Morning, I'm Admiral Awal, associated with the maritime think tank, BIMRAD. Excellency, I'm referring to the European Union global strategy that was published in 2016, meant for managing your external matters. Now, if you review what has happened since 2016, rather is a weak proceedings in terms of the Middle East. In JCPOA, you have not been able to implement the INSTEX, leading to not any going forward with that purpose. Again, with the Libya, recently European Union made a statement that it is the next Syria. Now, the threat is for Europe again. So, as a whole, given that global strategy paper that you have published, Europe has not been able to, you have done very good in social, economic, and integration part, but as far as raw geopolitics is concerned, Europe Union has proved to be very, very weak in managing and engaging with these issues. How do you look forward and evaluate your global strategy? Coming back to Turkey, its membership. Now, in 1990s, after the collapse of Soviet Union, at that time it was told that, the Cold War is gone, so it's no more important, Turkey. And the disqualification is too big, it is too poor, and it's too Muslim. Now the situation is that it's not poor. It is, 13th largest economy, and European context is the rather 4th largest economy. So it's rich. It's big, It's becoming geopolitically very, very powerful. The pipeline that I have mentioned, the pipeline between Russia and Turkey, avoiding the Ukraine. So that will have a serious implication on the energy issue. And its grab on the Mediterranean energy aspect. So it is growing big geopolitically. And to Muslim, yes, the Muslimness that European doesn't like, that is in rise. And I had a residency in Turkey for 2 years, and they're not going to change. That's the societal thing that, that Atatürk's, that godless secularism, as you have seen, all the institutions are being weakened. So the reclaiming that secularism is far off. So Turkey is, as you mentioned, is going on its way. So what is its prospect of being inducted to the European Union? Thank you.
Jolly good. Daniela?
All right, let me let me start from the end. I will try to give some comments on all these profound questions, but I'd like to start from the end, from Turkey and the geopolitical role of European Union. Now on Turkey, I think we have to be aware that Turkey is the country in the middle, and that defines its geopolitical and political role in general. The country in the middle, which is surrounded by, everybody from Russia to Arab world to Europe, and it's not surprising that it behaves as the country in the middle. What is new and what is changing is its withdrawal from the very strict, very clear pro-European Union stance and moving into a very new direction of geopolitical player with its own agenda, which really tries to be as independent as possible vis-à-vis Europe, vis-à-vis NATO. I was at events recently when the foreign minister of Turkey was explaining to us, saying, look, when we had a problem with Russia because of the shooting down of the Russian airplane over our territory, we were told by our Western partners to talk to Russia and to figure out, how to settle this. Now we have done that. As a result, we have become quite friendly, and now we are criticized by the same advisors that we have came too close to Russia. But that, I think, has an explanation. A country in the middle has to work with everybody, and I think that Turkey nowadays tries to develop a role in its geopolitical vision as a country in the middle, which has to work with everybody and has to be player in discussion with everybody. It's an important player vis-à-vis European Union because it holds the whole refugee issue in a state which European Union can tolerate, if I may put it this way. It's developing relations with Russia. It's developing its relations with the Arab world in an interesting new ways. So we, I think, have to start understanding that Turkey is an independent geopolitical player in the middle and have to start treating it as such, not as primarily a NATO member, not primarily as a EU candidate, not primarily as a Islamic country. It's a country in the middle. Now, on the question of the gas pipelines, here I think Russia is going to be very careful in the future. As you know, they have achieved an agreement with Ukraine to keep the pipelines through Ukraine active for the next few years. And I believe that this is going to remain so. They are not going to play everything on the direct pipelines with Turkey and then from Turkey to Europe or on Nord Stream 2. What I find most interesting in the immediate sense is the effect of these new pipelines on the market situation. Because if European Union is wise enough, it would keep as many openings as possible and buy, of course, liquefied gas from Qatar and from United States, but in a sense with a clear priority to figure out how to come to the most acceptable prices. none of these things have necessarily to develop into a kind of geopolitical dependence. All of them put together could be developed in a sense of market advantage. Now, I know that this is a risky hypothesis, but I think that that is a hypothesis which I would advise to take. Now, as I explained, I'm not an official of European Union. I have no role in the European Union at present, so that gives me an additional freedom to offer my own views and to make my own suggestions. And this is the suggestion which I would like to make. Secondly, on the question of values, double standards, Huntington, and all the rest, let me start with a small personal memoir. At the time when Samuel Huntington's book was very popular, in the 90s, the Security Council invited him to one of the retreats. I was at that time serving on the Security Council, and we had an evening with Samuel Huntington. And the shocking experience was how useless this theorizing is when it comes to the agenda of issues of the Security Council. We could not, the Security Council member, we could not take any advice or any thought as being relevant to what we were actually doing at that time. And we were dealing with Iraq, we were dealing with Kosovo at the time, we were dealing with Timor at the time, we were dealing with West Africa, and you know, a very diverse and huge agenda, but nowhere did Samuel Huntington help. Of course, it's one thing for the academics to develop concepts, to develop basic ideas, and that ideas can inspire further thinking, and that's their role. They are not there to advise diplomats or policy makers with direct policy advice. Policy advice is a totally different level. But what I take from that experience is that one has to be very careful with ideas. Ideas may be helpful or may be unhelpful. It really depends on policymakers what they do with them. So I would not want to go into this clash of civilization except as a warning that if things are managed badly, they're like to end badly. So we have to be really very careful about this. And when it comes to double standards, that of course is clearly a policy which goes badly and creates bad results. If people think that Palestinian issue will disappear because it is kind of ignored nowadays, this is not going to happen. It is going to be there and it is going to haunt us for a long time. That is something that I would like to say to my European friends, but also to my Arab friends, because I was in Doha debate, in a Doha forum in December last year, and I heard very little about Palestine there. So, I mean, what I'm saying is, don't take general theoretical concepts as policy advice, and think about their actual usefulness as an advice to avoid poor policy making and bad decisions. Now, of course, I could speak about Iran nuclear program and other things in detail, but we don't have time for that. What I would like to say is only this. You see, European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen surprised everybody when she said that she would want the current European Commission to be a geopolitical commission. Now, this is a very tall order for European Union, because European Union is a functional animal, and geopolitical role is not part of its function. So that takes European Union in a different type of waters. Now, that does not mean that European Union needs to be passive on political and geopolitical issues, but it has to be aware of its limitations. As a short-term objective, it would be quite important and possibly sufficient if European Union found a better definition of its relations with the United States, which it doesn't have at present. We don't see that definition being there. We see different opinions. Even in the past days, if you followed, Prime Minister Orban of Hungary pleaded that European Union should follow the line of United States on Iran more tightly. Now, this has very little to do with geopolitics and rational calculation. This is Orban's politics, and Orban wants to be a player in European Union, so he can exploit this difficult situation for his own needs. But how does European Union handle this, and how does European Union handle its internal discussions in a way which would lead it forward to a stronger role on international politics? That is a question which doesn't have an answer, and the answer could perhaps be developed in a short period of time, in a short run, meaning a couple of years, in a rational, sensible definition of relations between European Union and United States. United States is criticizing very validly that European Union is not doing enough in the field of defense. European Union can do more. We have to define what is that more we want to do in European Union, and how do we cooperate. I think the idea of strategic autonomy of European Union within NATO is a good one, but it's not properly defined as yet. And if European Union was able to offer something new in that regard, it would help. And finally, on the question of the aging population, integration, and all that, European Union has to do much more on the area, on the subject of integration of immigrants. Here, Europe in general doesn't have two results which one could describe as sufficiently good. A good example of relatively successful integration is Switzerland, which is not a member of European Union, but Switzerland has shown that bringing relatively large numbers of immigrants into the country can be managed if the upward social mobility of immigrants is made possible. So avoiding ghettoization, figuring out what brings upward social mobility for immigrants, that is a large part of the answer to this question. European Union as union does not have a policy in this regard. I mean, individual countries do. But I think the lesson that has been learned from integration, and that lesson is much more intense in the past years, should be used for the future. Liberal democracy may be on decline, but the European Union should make sure that liberal democracy prevails within the Union, but European Union should not be preaching to the others what kind of democracy they need to have. European Union should be really much more humble, much less religious in its pursuit of human rights. It must deal with human rights in a contextual sense, not in a quasi-religious sense, and then I think progress is possible.
Thank you. Yeah, there are also examples where, you see, we talked of populism. There are times when popularity morphs into populism, and therein lies some danger, of which we see some in our own neighborhood in the subcontinent. You know. Okay, the list is fairly large now. I think I'll have to close it. So what I'm going to do is to read out the names of those who are in it, and then I shall give the floor, as I said, 3 by 3 in the order in which I have named. I'll begin with Mr. Masood Khan, Ambassador Shahid Akhtar, Director General Andalib, Mr. Najibur Rahman, Dr. Faizul Islam Chaudhry, Barrister Ziaur Rahman Khan, and last but not least, Mr. Inayatullah Khan. And I will, if time permits, make some. Okay, and then Nahar Khan, and finally, if time, Nahar Khan will come before Inayatullah Khan then, and if time permits, I'll make some remarks. So, Masood Khan, Mr. Masood Khan.
Hello, good afternoon. One question I have is, it's about the U.S. You know, the world is now is focused on the U.S.-Iran tensions in the Middle East. So my question to you is that how do you see the crisis developing, and do you see any role for Europe in any possible de-escalation of this situation? And my second question would be is, you know, I think UK will be exiting January 31st from EU, and so I'm just wondering that what would be the current lineup of new countries seeking membership to the EU? Thank you.
Okay, the Iran question, Danilo, you had said that you would take up. I mean, even briefly in your thing. Yes, so I'd invite you to do that. But let me go to the next next in my list, Ambassador Shahid Akhtar.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Looking at the topic today, European Union and contemporary global scenario, I think the President made an excellent remark giving an overview, touching on mainly the political issues. But one important aspect which Bangladesh has direct involvement is the economic relations with the European Union countries. My question is that as Bangladesh, since you know a lot about Bangladesh, and we are very proud to hear from you and privileged to hear from you that you spoke so much about Bangladesh leaders and about what's happening in Bangladesh since its formation, the initial years, and today where we have reached. But we are also moving towards developing status very soon. You must be aware of that. And as we move to the developing status, the benefit that we accrued from the European Union, which was a big bonanza for Bangladesh, getting this quota and duty exemptions and things like that. What are the things which Bangladesh will be benefited in the coming years? There are certain, GSP plus issues which puts Bangladesh in a little additional challenges that Bangladesh has to face. And how would you think that the European Union will be able to accommodate? There will be some buffering in this, I understand, for a few years, and Bangladesh has to prepare itself. But on the other hand, it seems the European Union is also putting a lot of restrictions on Bangladesh, asking too many, demands. The textile industries, which is doing so well, has a lot of competition also at the same time, and with getting a lot of imposition coming from the European Union, parliamentarians, European countries. This is becoming quite a big burden on Bangladesh. How does European Union plays an overall role? I know the European Union is a little concerned and trying to move at the same time and develop certain institutions in Bangladesh which will be able to face, all these challenges which is coming in the near future. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. I'll recognize Andalib, Director General, Ministry of Foreign Affairs for Europe, and at this point I wish to acknowledge with thanks the participation of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in our discussions. We've always had your support, Andalib, and we hope and appreciate, we like to think, and we are confident that we will continue to receive the support of the Ministry in our future endeavors. You have the floor.
Thank you, sir. First of all, I'm grateful to Cosmos for inviting us to this event. In fact, my foreign secretary himself wanted to come, but unfortunately he couldn't make it because of some other very pressing engagements, and he sends his thanks for the invitation and also his regrets for not being able to come. And so I can assure you that we will always be engaging deeply. We always feel very happy to join in all the endeavors of Cosmos. Of course, it's really an honor listening to you, sir, President Turk. I'm sorry if I'll be repeating some of the points, but this is one of the issues I think that's relevant for all of us. So I'll take up on the point first raised by Ambassador Farooq Sobhan on how to handle the issue of rising populism. But I'll focus more on how to handle it from the Brussels perspective. You have, of course, said that it has to be a two-pronged approach from the national point of view as well as from the EU point of view, center point of view, if I can say. We now have a European Council president who is, I would say, less provocative than his predecessor. Mr. Charles Michel is known for being a person who can manage crisis very well. He has been a very successful Prime Minister of Belgium. We also have a new EU Commission president who is again less provocative than her predecessor. So with two persons there who are more of accommodating, I would say, how you would suggest that, because there's a huge complaint among the member states, particularly the eastern member states, about the dominance of the Commission. and how the Commission is a burgeoning, as you said, sir, a bureaucracy there. So how European Council and European Commission should now move forward, sending the message to the nationalists, to the populists, about about lowering their voice and becoming more of a liberal at this point. That's one point, sir. Second point is regarding the issue of EU-China relations. Of course, as you mentioned rightly, that there is no trade war. EU and China are working together in the WTO to make it more functional because there are some hiccups there. But at the same time, we are seeing that politically, although in trade sector there is no problem, they're working hand in hand, but in political sector, there are some issues there. EU has expressed officially its concern about the South China Sea position of China. They had some close meetings with ASEAN recently, where the immediate past HRVP very clearly said that she would be with the ASEAN member states against their position on China and the, if I can use the word, aggression of China in the South China Sea. So, and also you know that recently they declared that they would have a defense attaché in Jakarta, which is a new thing. There was no, EU was always focused on security, not on defense. But now they are coming in the defense issues. Having a defense attaché in Jakarta is a big message to China, I would say. So how you would see this EU-China relations in terms of political issues, not on trade issues, I would say. I'm sorry for taking so much time, but the last point, if I can, sir, again, taking up on the point raised by Ambassador Shahid Akhtar, that's always my concern as the Foreign Office guy, the Bangladesh-EU relations. But I'll go one step further than what Shahid Akhtar has said about the trade issues. If I can go into the political issues now. We have our, if I can say, our best friend in EU leaving EU very soon. UK has always been our friend in EU. Whenever there was any problem, any issue regarding human rights, regarding the labor issues, we could always bank on UK for supporting us there, for explaining to other EU member states about the ground realities here, the historical background of any issue here. Now that UK is leaving, we will have to nurture a new relationship, build and nurture a new relationship in EU, particularly I would say with the Eastern countries, because in the Eastern members of EU, there is less information maybe or less understanding about Bangladesh nowadays, which is a bit unfortunate because that part of EU was always a big supporter of Bangladesh at the nascent stage of Bangladesh. Now we do not have that relationship with them. We are more focused on West Europe. If you look at our missions, most of our missions are in West Europe, not in the eastern part, although we are gradually building our missions there. So sir, how you would suggest that, again, it's very much from a self-interest, how you would suggest that we strengthen our political relations with European Union in the coming days in the context of Brexit? Thank you, sir.
Thank you. All right. Again, a set of very profound questions. Now, I would like to say that on the question of economic relations between European Union and Bangladesh, we have the ambassador of European Union here, so she may perhaps update us on the most immediate or most practical aspects of it. My talk, of course, cannot go into this questions of immediate negotiations and agenda of discussions that you are having and you are likely to have. I think I mentioned the question of obviously European Green Deal as an important framework within which one has to think about future relations with Europe, and also to understand that textiles is not something that is there forever. I know I'm saying something risky here, but I'm coming from a family which was very much about textiles in my parents and grandparents, and textiles is no longer the main economic thing for that family or for my country. So, I mean, there are changes which one has to really follow with great attention and a great sense of nuance. And I understand that there are many new things happening in Bangladesh nowadays which represent an evolution of the whole textile sector. I'm sure that's there, and the ambassador knows much more, and maybe she would want to say something about that. But I think in a more general sense, the framework of European Green Deal, the whole question of circular economy, all that has to be factored in, and that how to do it, I'm not an expert. You need expertise, you need experts for that. Now, on Iran, you know, there are many aspects of this fundamental challenge of our security situation in the world today. Is non-proliferation regime going to survive, given what has been happening? Are people going to believe in non-proliferation anymore? We'll have an important non-proliferation conference starting in May this year, and the Secretary General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres, already in his very succinct short statement last week expressed concern that the way things developed with Iran can actually kill non-proliferation. Let us be very careful about this. This is a very dangerous development. And when European Union pleads for the retention and survival of Iran nuclear deal, I think this is an important message which the United States has to take seriously. This is not something to say, well, you know, Europeans don't know what else to say, so they talk about the need to preserve the JCPOA. No, this is a very serious matter of global security, and I think that the European Union ministers were right to put their focus on this. Now the question is, what happens next? How does European Union deal with the rest of the problem for the next month in let's say, short term? My hypothesis here is that a critical union towards its state action. There will be another round of very severe sanctions against Iran, which in Doha Forum in mid-December, I listened to the speech by US Minister of Finance Steven Mnuchin, who spoke about sanctions against Iran being an alternative to war. An alternative to war, and therefore a good thing. Now we now have war. Let us be honest about this. We had shooting of a senior Iranian military personality, and that's an act of war. I mean, of course, there can be other terminological innovations around this. And, you know, diplomacy is very good in terminological ways and papering over and fudging things and so on. But let us be completely aware of the level of danger which has arisen as a result of that act and as a result of the Iranian response. Now that response obviously was also carefully calculated, so the world at very least avoided a problem which could be actually fatal, a problem of miscommunication, if the two sides understood each other wrongly. But it seems that the two sides have understood each other relatively well and didn't want to overstep the red line. All right, so this is the situation. But does an additional round of sanction cross that line? Now that's a big question. And how does European Union relate to sanctions? My advice would be to take this question of sanctions extremely seriously, understand that terminology which says that sanctions are an alternative to war is simply not sufficient, that sanctions may well be a form of warfare. In the classical international law, we had a terminology of hostile measures short of war. Now this terminology is no longer used. The terminology of sanctions is used, and sanctions convey an impression that there is something legitimate involved, because you sanction something when you have the authority to sanction. It's not a pure power game. It is exercise of power on the basis of legitimacy. I am not sure whether a new round of sanctions against Iran would have a sufficiently strong legitimacy. That would be my analytical proposition. And my policy proposition would be that European Union should take very seriously the question of sanctions and see how it could not only distance itself from that, but also how European Union could influence the situation. Now that, of course, is a very tall order, something that the European Union was not able to do so far, and we have to understand that. That's on sanctions. Then I have a few more questions, but I will be shorter on this. On the question of the populism and how to handle this, we said, of course, one thing is nation states, and I have tried to explain that populism is not the only political phenomenon, that there are others, and that we should not be too quick in saying that populism dominates European countries. Far from that, and even in countries where populism has moved far, it may not last or it may not be decisive. But what can European institutions do? Well, as I said, conference on the future of Europe would be a wonderful opportunity as far as the opportunities designed by European institutions are concerned. I think that the conference on the future of Europe should involve everybody who can have an influence on that question, and should take this problem very seriously and provide a European institutional regional framework for a very serious political discussion and polemic, I would say, polemic with populist tendencies. On the question of EU-China relationship and political aspects of that, I think that on South China Sea, European Union has to understand that this is a problem which is attempted primarily by ASEAN countries through the Code of Conduct in South China Sea. Now, of course, there are those who would say that Code of Conduct can never be really a full solution, and there may be a good reason to believe that, but at least it is an instrument which should be supported. So I think that on that question there is a platform on which European Union can work. There are others which are perhaps less developed, less explored, and that would require a rather specialized discussion, I'm afraid. I think that Hong Kong issue should be dealt with on the basis of the principle of one country, two systems. I'm amazed that the political and economic elite of Hong Kong is not offering any real leadership in this situation. European efforts cannot be particularly helpful because this is part of China's own situation. But the really absent actor seems to be the economic business elite of Hong Kong, where we can have a, this would require again a more specialized discussion. And then as far as the political relations between between the European Union and Bangladesh is concerned, of course there is no substitute for UK. UK is unique, UK is great, and UK is outside European Union. So we have to be, cognizant of that and figure out who are the partners. My suggestion would be European Commission in the first place. European Commission in the first place. If I was foreign minister, Joseph Borrell as one of your first partners in discussion, because European Union is going to be an important partner, and seeing Joseph Borrell doesn't mean that Foreign Secretary Raab shouldn't be the host of the Bangladeshi foreign minister in the future either. So I think that both will have to be in place.
If you want an English-speaking partner, you have Ireland, no? I mean,
sure.
Oh, yeah, okay. I'll recognize, start by recognizing Mr. Najibur Rahman, the immediate past principal secretary to the Prime Minister, and then I have Mrs. Tamina Khan and Dr. Faizul Islam Chaudhry. Najibur.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm also representing a new entity that has been formed last year, Humayun Rashid Chaudhry Memorial Council, after the name of a very famous diplomat who rose to the position of the President of the 41st General Assembly and also became the Speaker of Parliament. And we are trying to basically connect the young generation to his life, works, and memories. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate your very capable stewardship of the session, and Excellency President Turk. It has been very illuminating. And I have basically one comment and two questions. The comment is some of us who spent some years in New York and have seen the archive of the UN, we are basically cognizant of the role your country played, the former Yugoslavia, Slovenia, and also the UK in getting Bangladesh as a member of the United Nations those days. The question is, the first question would be, I'm referring to your comments, and I'm very impressed that you compared the European Union standing on two legs, one being the one leg being representing the members, the other leg representing the institutions. And my question is on the institutions. As you know, at the international level, European Union is playing a very critical trend-setting role. The adoption of the Sustainable Development Goals or signing of the Paris Treaty. These are two important contracts that came up to my mind. But now that the different scenarios are being evolved, are the institutions ready to fulfill the EU obligations towards this type of global contracts? Incidentally, you have not made a reference to Sustainable Development Goals or Paris Treaty in your presentation. The second question would be, and I'm asking your forgiveness if I will be harsh. I liked your assessment on the position of the UN Secretary General, that basically it demands that he has to be strong, he has to be basically fulfilling the need of the hour. The assessment is very, very true. But will it be unfair if I make the similar assessment on the EU now? Currently, I think EU is not taking a very proactive role on many occasions. I'm having the European ambassador is very active in Bangladesh, but in terms of addressing global issues, EU is seen to be playing a very reactive role. Someone else is calling the shot, being proactive. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you very much. Mrs. Tamina Khan.
Hello, good afternoon. I'm Tamina Inayat. Sorry. I'm welcoming, hi, can you hear? Your Excellency, Daniela Turk, and Mr. Iftikhar. So, I have a question. I'm Tamina Inayat, and I'm involved with art. We are a Cosmos Gallery, and I'm a Zonchen, which I do for women empowerment in Bangladesh. So I have a question for Dr. Iftikhar. Coming closer to home in South Asia, there's a strong feeling in some quarters that pluralism in today's India is on decline. This can lead to escalation of regional tension in our part of the world. Any thoughts on this?
Okay, I mean, I have some thoughts on this, of course, but what happens is that since you have agreed to speak to this topic as well, and this is something after my heart, I mean, I made a mention of it about popularism turning to populism, and we are seeing a bit of it in parts of the neighborhood. As Tamina has said, that if there is a decline of the values that you spoke of earlier on, which ties Europe as a glue together, does this decline threaten cohesion? That's the other thing in any region like ours. So that, of course, I mean, she and I ask you that question together. We would have you react to these, and then I'll get the last set of speakers.
Okay, so I have two sets of questions. Let me start with the second one. Obviously, the developments in South Asia have given rise to concern. In particular, in the past year or so, we have seen in India a rise of Hindu nationalism, which has become more violent. We have seen developments affecting Jammu and Kashmir, which have become which have actually raised the level of uncertainty. Now, all this is happening within a single large state, and therefore, it has been treated mostly as an internal affair. Although the human rights NGOs have been very vocal about these developments. What I would like to say is simply that the level of concern that exists around the world around these developments should not be underestimated. Although those concerns are not very vocally expressed, they are not articulated in a sense of very serious political critique, but they are there, and sooner or later they will become more public. Concerns are there. The question is there a way of calming down and moving things to really better situation in terms of respecting the traditional values of democracy, respect, tolerance, and so on. Now, I understand that you are going to discuss this with Mr. Srinivasan, who is coming soon to, not necessarily in terms of any immediate political situation.
His
but
responses may be different, so.
Yeah, well, I don't know. I know him, you see. Having been around for a long time by now, I met many people, and I would ask him quite directly and also advise him. So will you. Very good. Based on the fact that the concerns that exist are not necessarily very loudly expressed, but that doesn't mean that they are not there. And this is something that should be of concern and interest to everybody, including your speaker in February. So that would be my quick reaction to this. And obviously there are many more things to say, but I'm not the person to go further. Now, on the earlier questions about the challenges of the European institutions. Now, see, European Union benefited in 2015. I mean, of course, there was this wave of migration which overshadowed many other things, but there were good things happening in 2015, especially the adoption of Paris Agreement and before that of Sustainable Development Goals. Now, the important thing here is to take advantage of these achievements and make them irreversible. And I think the UN Secretary General is trying to do precisely that and is working closely with the European Union for that purpose, especially when it comes to Sustainable Development Goals. Because Sustainable Development Goals do not require that every country in the world has the same dynamic of success, but it does require that progress is made in different parts of critically important parts of the world. So one partner in that regard is clearly European Union. That's an important priority. Another part from the UN perspective, I think, would be China. One expects a great deal of China in this particular moment in terms of movement towards environmental sustainability, things which have been recognized by the actors in China themselves. So working with these major players, and the European Union is one, is critically important. I agree with you that European Union has been risk averse and often introverted, especially when it came to questions of Middle East, which is the immediate neighborhood, and one would expect a more active approach of European Union. But internal divisions and other factors have made this very difficult to do, and the risk aversion which has developed over time is a problem today. But there are opportunities, and one opportunity is the invitation which Joseph Borrell issued to Mohammad Javad Zarif, the foreign minister of Iran. No, this would be really a great opportunity to see what exactly European Union can do. I spoke about Iran earlier. I'm not going to repeat that. But then again, you see, this sort of meetings, if they happen, should be well prepared. You know, in diplomacy, you don't just invite somebody to come and chat. You need to know what the actual progress can be. You may not have an immediate outcome, but you need to have an idea of the purpose of the visit and the direction of process that will result from the visit. So for the diplomats on the EU side and on the Iranian side and on all other sides, this could be one of the most interesting moments right now, how to prepare, how to make sure that the visit happens and what kind of preparations are needed for it to happen. And that, I think, would be a large part of answer to your question, because this is the challenge of the moment. If the European Union figures out an approach that responds to the challenge in this context, then of course we are making progress. If it doesn't, we are still in the sphere of risk-averse attitude and consequent lack of relevance of the European Union. Now these are the answers, and then...
Thank you. I will proceed in the following manner henceforth. I have 3 speakers on the list, which would be Barrister Ziaur Rahman, then Nahar Khan, and Shayan Khan. They will ask the questions, and then I will give the floor to the ambassador of the European Union to sort of make some remarks. Then you conclude by making your 2-minute
2 minutes, very good.
The final points. So I begin by giving the floor now to Barrister Ziaur Rahman Khan. Former Member of Parliament and former Chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And we're glad to have you here, Mr. President. My very first question, seeing that it's a reflection for the future on the European Union, my very first question is Quo Vadis? Well, after that, I think we all notice...
Whither goest thou for those who are not into Latin?
Oh, where goest thou? Where are you going?
Yeah.
Where is the European Union going? Because there seems to be a very disturbing element in this relationship of the European Union with the rest of the world. You seem to be on a downward slide towards abrogating your rights as an entity to the United States. And this has been going on for a fairly long time. And as we realize in the rest of the world, particularly the third world, we realize that the United States wants to be the head honcho of the whole world, if possible. And this is, it's particularly disturbing for us when we look at Europe today. Europe is not throwing up a lot of inspiring leadership. And what's worrying a lot of us here is that after Merkel and Macron, there are hardly any spokesmen in Europe. There's hardly any recognizable leader, somebody that can be referred to as a leader in Europe today. And this is even more disturbing because Europe is out on a sort of a power grab. America is out on a power grab. That the rest of the world must be subservient to the United States or nothing else. They've already done it to many smaller countries, and what is most disturbing for the whole world is that they've bypassed the United Nations on several occasions, particularly in 2003 when they went into Iraq to fight a war which is completely one-sided, like all American wars. It is a one-sided affair. And then this war on terror that the Americans have unleashed upon the world, I find Europe rather silent on this matter, as if Europe has become a sort of an observer and not a participant in world affairs. And if America is allowed to do this, a lot of us view America as being the leading rogue in the world. And they are now now calling other people, other countries or other people rogues. Like they've blackened Iran's guards, the Iranian nation, and even yesterday there were sanctions. Just yesterday. They sanctioned 8 individuals and several other things. They've gone on sanctioning. And you're quite right, Mr. President, when you said that, quoting somebody, that sanctions is supposed to be as a substitute for war, which is ridiculous. Sanctions is a provocation for war. In fact, it leads more quickly towards a war. And they've been imposing sanctions ad infinitum. This is the 3rd or 4th occasion when they tried to impose sanctions. So what we want to see now is if the European Union would, post-Brexit, they've already lost one down and how many to go, would the United Nations, the European Union get its act together and be what we think? Many countries in the world tend to think or view the European Union as a sort of a balancing factor between the East and West, or between the Americans and China, Russia combined. So would they be able to play that role is something that we would look forward to, because they have to play a balancing act. We have nowhere else to go. Particularly the depressed third world countries, or so-called third world countries, although we today strive to be going out of the third world stigma. We are particularly worried for one other reason that may not be freely mentioned on most occasions, which is that most American actions, including the hit on Soleimani, were prompted by Israel. So if America is led by Israel and Europe is being led by America, then eventually Israel is the head of the world. Israel is ruling the world. So one has to keep these things in mind, particularly for we get the raw end of the stick. So it is for us to be more worried than others, and which is why we started this by asking this question, where are we going, and where is the European Union going to end up? Will it be a balancing factor? Will it be in favor of trying to restrain the runaway horse that the Americans under Trump is likely to be? And would it be good for the rest of the world? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Zia. Dr. Faizul Islam Chaudhry.
Thanks. I stand up. Thanks, Chairman, Cosmos Foundation. Thanks, Chairman of this session, and His Excellency, President of Slovenia, Dr. Daniela Turk. We are very much amazed by your very pleasant and soothing discussion. I have some question, but the question was already been done and the answer is already given. So I will not repeat this question. I end my speech by one simple comment. Very nice comment you have done. You have got, the European Union have got 2 legs, but without hand movement will not be pleasant and soothing. So I think you should have also 2 hands. In one hand, you should suppress the arrogant side of the world, and another hand, you should evoke the sleeping side of the world. This is my comment. You should have 2 legs, as well as you said, you should also have 2 hands also. Thank you.
Thank you, Faisal. Okay, Ms. Nahar Khan.
Good afternoon. I'm Nahar Khan from Cosmos Group. Excellency Dr. Turk, I have 2 questions for you today. My background is in communication technology, hence my first question. 2019 saw the rise of the technology war between Beijing and Washington. In 2020, it seems the restrictions on flow of technology will continue. In your opinion, how does this tech war impact the health of the global system, particularly the EU and also emerging economies such as Bangladesh? So is this an opportunity or a threat for the emerging economies? And should EU work with its Asian partners as well as the US on lessening border impediments, updating trade rules and regulations? My second question is, what do you think should be the role of the middling powers like Bangladesh in the contemporary global scene? Thank you.
Thank you, Nahar. And finally, Shayan Khan.
Thank you. Thank you to the chair and
identify yourself.
Yes, I'm Shayan Khan. I'm with Cosmos Group's Media Assets. Thank you to the chair and welcome, Dr. Turk. It's very pleasing to hear that you're also already looking forward to coming back. But I don't know about what you've had yet, but having some experience of Slovenian taste buds, I would ask you to be careful about our chicken curries. And as for my question, I had an Iran question, but I think it has been discussed enough. It has kind of evolved into something that you mentioned about a difficulty between relations between the EU and the US at the moment that you're facing. So I'll just be very direct and like to know from you whether there is a view within Europe that this is an aberration, is only specific to the Trump administration at the moment, because or do you see a more fundamental long-term shift in terms of US behavior, or is it just this period of Donald Trump that we have to deal with? And the second question that I'll quickly just ask, it's a theoretical one actually. You mentioned for the first part of your speech that you mentioned also, of course, the Fukuyama's famous end of history phrase and how it has been swept away by first multipolarity and then a new type of multipolarity, which is what we're experiencing at the moment. Now, this new type of multipolarity, do you actually see that it can accommodate even non-state actors, such as social movements, and how that has actually allowed even the green movements in Europe that you mentioned to become more politically, I suppose, impactful? So that's it.
As to curry, by the way, they have kebab chi, which is could be equally hot. All right. You want to come in now? Before you do that?
Maybe you should also comment on this two hands metaphor. I mean, this is a typical question for ambassadors. I may have something short to say.
Thank you. Well, I would have a lot of things to say because this has been such a thought-provoking and very in-depth discussion. So thank you very much also for inviting me. First, I want to respond to your question on the everything but arms trade facilitation that the EU provides to Bangladesh. Let's be clear, this is, I think, a major instrument that has really helped Bangladesh more than, I would say, our bilateral aid portfolio. We give this to all LDCs, so there are about 45 countries in the world that benefit. But which is the country that has stood out since the beginning and has reaped most of the benefits? It's Bangladesh. Bangladesh has reaped about 70% of the trade facilitation of all goods that go into the European Union, mainly based on the RMG, the ready-made garment sector. So this is, I think, has been enormously helpful. There is no other organization in the world that grants this kind of privilege to Bangladesh. But I also want to point out that this, of course, is not a blank check and it doesn't come without strings attached. What are these strings? Is that we can welcome these goods and services, goods into the EU when there is a respect of fundamental labor rights and human rights standards compliant to the ILO. And this becomes even more important for Bangladesh because Bangladesh is under scrutiny because it is the biggest exporter of all LDCs. So naturally, people in the EU, the manufacturers, are looking closely to Bangladesh saying, yeah, well, we're opening our borders and all these goods do come in. But we need to have a guarantee that these are produced fairly, respecting these standards. And that is why we have to make sure that all this is ILO compliant. And of course compliant to our own standards. Now, the Rana Plaza incident, I mean the tragedy back in 2013, really opened the eyes of the European consumer and said, well, something must be done. And this is why we also embarked on the Accord, Alliance, and the Sustainability Compact. And so far, I think we have seen that Bangladesh has really put in place a number of commendable changes to the way in which garments are produced, etc. So it has already had an influence. But we cannot say that, oh, let's for the moment close our eyes on other rules that are not yet being implemented. So this is what we're working towards. We have a process that is EBA, the Everything But Arms, which is the instrument, an EBA engagement process, which has started already last year, where we agreed with the government of Bangladesh that we look at a roadmap to full implementation. And let me say, this is not only EU that looks critically, but also the ILO itself. And they started last year with a commission of inquiry. So it's in Bangladesh's interest to work with us to become compliant on these issues. And I think there are good, very good signals that we are reaching this. Bangladesh government has responded to our request for a roadmap, and there will be a new EBA mission coming in March. So I think it's all in good hands. But it's, let me once more point out that we're doing this for Bangladesh. Now, another consideration I wanted to point out is the very ambitious strategy of Bangladesh, who's saying, yes, our economy is to a great extent built on the RMG sector. They're exporting now $35 billion a year. This could grow to 50 billion in the coming years, even 100 billion by 2050. This may all be very well, but I think what we also need to look at is how do we want to see this sector develop? And I think President Turk has very rightly pointed out the changes in consumer patterns, in awareness about where the textile industry should lead. And this is also the young people in Europe. Do we still want the fast fashion? Is that the model that we want to continue with? And we already see a kind of, you know, the recycling, the circular economy is going to be much more important. And we should reach out and work with Bangladesh and other emerging economies to make this a world system and make sure that we ultimately produce more sustainably. And there are many opportunities for Bangladesh itself. And I think more globally, the Green Deal and sustainable energy, sustainable economy will create jobs and will create enormous opportunities. I also, can I quickly also react of Quo Vadis, or where does the EU go? I'm a little bit astonished that yeah, we are seen to be not very proactive, not a very forceful actor at the moment. I think, first of all, let's not forget we have a new team at the helm of the EU. This new team started on 1st of December. And I think, as you also rightly said, President Turk, that Ursula von der Leyen has very forcefully said what she's looking for is a geopolitical commission. Now, that's, of course, very ambitious, and we also know how the EU institution works. The European Commission is the guardian of the treaty and is of the European treaties, and is also the institution that proposes new legislation. Very often where we see where we are blocked is by the member states themselves. We could be more ambitious, but I think it's sometimes a very complex day-to-day negotiation within the Council that holds us back. So this is something we need to really look at. The populism, I think we're doing a lot. One thing I would like to point out is the initiatives that are being taken in terms of looking at cyber and the flow of fake news and the platforms on some social media that really influences this populist agenda. So by tackling fake news, by tackling these media platforms, I think there is a lot we can do, and the EU is doing it also in the European Commission as well. And our support to Bangladesh, I think, just a few words, we've always supported this country right from its independence. And politically, I think, Andalip, you're right. You feel maybe that it's more a commercial relationship. But we feel that now with the new High Representative at the helm, Josep Borrell, we are keen to have a meeting with the Foreign Minister as soon as possible. And I think we were already quite on the right track to have a meeting this month on the 16th of January in the margins of the Raisina dialogue. But unfortunately, we heard that, not with the foreign minister, but with the state minister of foreign affairs. And apparently he's not traveling to India after all, so we will have to find another opportunity for this. But just to illustrate that this was one of the first meetings our new High Representative was going to have with somebody from with the government of Bangladesh representative to give new impetus to our relations. So let me stop here. Thank you very much for a very stimulating debate.
Thank you, Ambassador. Final words from our distinguished.
Thank you. Well, I would like to first thank the ambassador for giving us a very good explanation of the situation, but also an illustration of what these two legs metaphor means, because the institutions can only go that far. I mean, they have to work with member states, and that depends. It's not always easy to do. Now, I'd like to start by saying that I'm very grateful for this suggestion for the two hands metaphor. But I will have to figure out how to use it, because you see, very often people say on the one hand this, on the other hand that, and then usually when that sort of dynamic is included, then you don't get anything at the end. So this one hand, the other hand, has to be figured out more carefully. And I will do that, I promise, I will do that. Now, on a few other things very quickly. You see, I agree that war on terror is something that has created huge damage to international community and international cooperation. Huge damage from the beginning on, because it opened up kind of a Pandora's box and opened this open question which has always been there. One man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter, and so forth. And that's only part of the problem. Now it is spreading to new levels, to new situations. And I think for the European Union, it's really very important to understand that this philosophy, not always stated, but always in the back of the minds of proponents of war on terror, is extremely harmful thing which has to be given limits. This can't be everything, you can't describe everything you don't like as terror and everything you want to punish as war on terror, and create a false sense of legitimacy in that regard. Now, the critical point at this moment, once again, is the question of additional sanctions on Iran. This is something to be discussed very carefully. This is something not to be accepted as a good substitute for the use of military force. It's another stage of something that could lead to really shooting war in the near future. It's a very dangerous direction. And obviously, the European Union will have to reflect on this, think very carefully and find solutions, find a way out. And I think that it is not too much to say that this new round of sanctions puts a direct threat to the non-proliferation in essence. Non-proliferation can be destroyed if this thing goes further. So that's would be my analysis and my hope that EU will find a voice in that regard, and then this question of quo vadis will not be as dramatic as it seems now, because it does relate. I understand this quo vadis question does relate to the security aspect, which is the most fundamental aspect of international relations. I'm not going to talk about technology too much because we'll have opportunity tomorrow to do it. Just to say that, of course, I am in favor. I see clear preference for cooperation than other things when it comes to Asia-Europe technological relations. I think we need to find ways of cooperating, and we'll discuss this in detail tomorrow. Thirdly and finally, on the final set of questions, you see on this chicken curry, I have pondered this last night when I came here, and I decided to take a cautious approach. So I decided for tandoori chicken, which of course is not local, but it's a way towards further steps. I will see what kind of cuisine I enjoy today. But I started in a cautious way. When it comes to the question more seriously on whether this U.S. approach towards EU represents a temporary aberration, or is it something more fundamental? I would say we should not underestimate the underlying tendencies which are long-term in nature. We'll see whether this is an aberration or more than an aberration, but I think that European Union has to take this challenge very seriously. Once again, this whole question of Iran has really put into sharp relief, sharp focus this question, and the European Union has to figure out how to establish a more equitable, more equal, and more real partnership with the United States, which we currently don't have. The European Union is simply pushed in situations in which it is difficult to function as an ally. You know, people say, well, you know, allies have to support the United States. It's not so. It has to be based on consent. It has to be based on consultations at least. Now, in 2001, the then Secretary of Defense of the United States, Donald Rumsfeld, famously explained that we live in an era where no longer coalition defines the mission. It is the mission that defines the coalition. Say no, it is the coalition that defines the mission. And when it comes to the questions of Iran, it is now for the coalition to speak, to say what are the limits of the mission. What are the limits of war on terror? War on terror has never been accepted as an underlying conceptual base for practical action. And it should not be allowed to kind of creep into the mainstream of political analysis and action. Finally, on the new type of multilateralism, yes, it does include non-state actors and everything else, but that's a complicated theme to be discussed on another occasion. Now, Mr. Chairman, I have spoken far too much, but that was partly because I come to a country where I know that the intellectual concern about these questions is really very strong. I know that from before, I know that from many contacts I had with my Bangladeshi diplomatic interlocutors and intellectuals. So I took the liberty of speaking more than would be normally expected. And please take into account, I'm former president, so I can, I can speak otherwise.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. Thank you. I will bring this session to a close, Danilo. Not just because you have been president, you have spoken long and we have heard, and we have learned. We have learned because you are the intellect that you are, and also that you have continued your interests through other mediums other than politics, and we are looking to your further contribution to global stability, development, etc. We've had a full discussion. I want to thank you all for your very enthusiastic participation. As someone said, this has been one of our best. Nonetheless, just before I conclude, I want to refer to the parable that Barrister Ziaur Rahman mentioned, and it came up several times on Quo Vadis. The background, of course, is that Peter was fleeing a repression in Rome, and as he was fleeing, Jesus was he suddenly had a vision of Jesus approaching Rome, and Jesus had been crucified long ago, of course. And as he saw Jesus, he said, Domini quo vadis, O Lord, whither goest thou? And Jesus said, to Rome, to shame Peter. So in many ways, today's European Union is in that position. I mean, the idea is to go back to Rome, to the Treaty of Rome, which is in many ways the essence of what European Union, Europeanism is about. So with these words, I will now give the floor to our chairman of Cosmos, who have very kindly hosted this event, as he has hosted many others and will host many more in the future. So, Inayef, the floor is yours.
In fact, I have assigned Nahar to do that, but I really want to thank everybody here who took the trouble to attend this conference. A very special thank to President Dr. Daniel Turk for your very, very enlightening and thought-provoking presentation. And I think this has been one of our most, I would say, enjoyable seminar. I hope you'll keep your promise by keeping in touch with us, and hopefully you will return to Bangladesh again. And Dr. Iftikhar, he flew in from New York on way to Singapore to chair this session. So I thank everybody here. Thank you. Let's give a big applause for Dr. Daniel Turk for his brilliant presentation. Thank you.
The symposium is closed.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for your presence today, and a special thanks to our honorable guests and speakers. We would like to give a token of appreciation to our distinguished panelists. Dr. Danilo Turk, former president of Slovenia. Dr. Iftikhar Ahmed Chaudhry, Principal Research Fellow at ISAS, National University, Singapore. Mr. Inayatullah Khan, Chairman, Cosmos Foundation.
I'd like to invite Renji here and for your support and your participation. Let's take a picture.
I would also like to request Mr. Andalib, DG Europe, Ministry of Foreign Affairs, to come and accept a gift as a token of their continued support to Cosmos Foundation. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Now lunch will be served on the 13th floor. We request you to join us, and we look forward to seeing you again. Thank you.